Hello, my name's Steve Price, and I'm going to read a few passages from a famous short story by Conrad Aiken called Silent Snow, Secret Snow. Because I'm not reading the entire story, it's much too long for this venue, I want to give you a brief synopsis of the story so that what I read here will hopefully make sense. The story is about a young boy named Paul who finds it increasingly difficult to pay attention to the normal activities of his daily life, like school and play, and grows more and more distant from his family. Instead, he finds himself entranced by daydreaming about snow. This begins one morning, lying in bed, awaiting the approach of the postman. As Paul's obsession with snow increases, and he becomes more distant and indifferent to the world around him, his parents become increasingly alarmed, to the point they bring in a doctor to examine him. I'm going to read 3 excerpts from the story's opening lines, Paul's first encounter with the snow, and the end of the climactic scene with the doctor. Like all good literature, this story's meaning is open to multiple interpretations. For me, it's about a young boy's descent into mental illness, probably schizophrenia. If you're not familiar with this story, I highly recommend you track it down and read it. It's included in many anthologies of classic American short fiction, and it's beautifully written, so I hope I do it justice. Here goes, Silent Snow, Secret Snow. It begins. Just why it should have happened, or why it should have happened just when it did, he could not, of course, possibly have said, nor perhaps could it even have occurred to him to ask. The thing was above all a secret, something to be preciously concealed from mother and father, and to that very fact it owed an enormous part of its deliciousness. It was like a peculiarly beautiful trinket to be carried unmentioned in one's trouser pocket, a rare stamp, an old coin, a few tiny gold links found trodden out of shape on a path in the park, a pebble of carnelian, a seashell distinguishable from all others by an unusual spot or stripe. And if it were any one of these, he carried around with him everywhere a warm and persistent and increasingly beautiful sense of possession. Nor was it only a sense of possession, it was also a sense of protection. It was as if, in some delightful way, his secret gave him a fortress, a wall behind which he could retreat into heavenly seclusion. The next passage I'm going to read describes Paul's first awareness of the postman's slowly disappearing footsteps in the snow. But on this particular morning, the first morning, as he lay there with his eyes closed, he had for some reason waited for the postman. He wanted to hear him come round the corner, and that was precisely the joke. He never did. He never came. He never had come round the corner again. For when at last the steps were heard, they had already, he was quite sure, come a little down the hill to the first house. And even so, the steps were curiously different. They were softer. They had a new secrecy about them. They were muffled and indistinct. And while the rhythm of them was the same, it now said a new thing. It said peace. It said remoteness. It said cold. It said sleep. And he had understood the situation at once. Nothing could have seemed simpler. There had been snow in the night, such as all winter he had been longing for, and it was this which had rendered the postman's first footsteps inaudible, and the later ones faint. Of course, how lovely! And even now it must be snowing. It was going to be a snowy day. The long, white, ragged lines were drifting and sifting across the street, across the faces of the old houses, whispering and hushing, making little triangles of white in the corners between cobblestones, seething a little when the wind blew them over the ground to a drifted corner. And so it would be all day, getting deeper and deeper and silenter and silenter. All this time, of course, while he lay in bed, he had kept his eyes closed, listening to the near progress of the postman, the muffled footsteps thumping and slipping on the snow-sheathed cobbles, and all the other sounds, the double knocks, a frosty, far-off voice or two, a bell ringing thinly and softly, as if under a sheet of ice, had the same slightly abstracted quality as if removed by 1 degree from actuality, as if everything in the world had been insulated by the snow. But when at last, pleased, he opened his eyes and turned them toward the window to see for himself this long-desired and now so clearly imagined miracle, what he saw instead was brilliant sunlight on a roof. And when astonished, he jumped out of bed and stared down into the street, expecting to see the cobblestones obliterated by the snow. He saw nothing but the bare, bright cobblestones themselves. So the falling snow and that postman's footsteps are a progressive plot device in this story. Every morning for a week, Paul listens carefully for the postman's steps on the cobblestones outside his house, and each morning they become more indistinct. When Paul's withdrawal from normal life becomes unbearable for his worried parents, they arrange for a doctor to visit the house to interview Paul and, they hope, make a diagnosis. The doctor says, "You must surely know, be aware that you have not been quite yourself of late. Don't you know that?" It was amusing to watch the doctor's renewed attempt at a smile, a queer, disorganized look, as of confidential embarrassment. "I feel all right, sir," he said, and again gave the little laugh. "And we're trying to help you," the doctor's tone sharpened. "Yes, sir, I know, but why? I'm all right. I'm just thinking, that's all." His mother made a quick movement forward, resting a hand on the back of the doctor's chair. "Thinking," she said, "but my dear, about what?" This was a direct challenge, and would have to be directly met. But before he met it, he looked again into the corner by the door, as if for reassurance. He smiled again at what he saw, at what he heard. The little spiral was still there, still softly swirling, like the ghost of a white kitten chasing the ghost of a white tail, and making as it did so the faintest of whispers. It was all right. If only he could remain firm, everything was going to be all right. "Oh, about anything, about nothing, you know, the way you do." "You mean daydreaming?" "Oh, no, thinking." "But thinking about what?" "Anything." He laughed a third time, this time happening to glance upwards toward his mother's face. He was appalled at the effect his laughter seemed to have upon her. Her mouth had opened in an expression of horror. This was too bad. Unfortunate. He had known it would cause some pain. Of course, but he hadn't expected it to be quite as bad as this. Perhaps if he just gave them a tiny, gleaming hint. "About the snow," he said. "What on earth?" This was his father's voice. The brown slippers came a step nearer on the hearthrug. "But my dear, what do you mean?" This was his mother's voice. The doctor merely stared. "Just snow, that's all. I like to think about it." "Tell us about it, my boy." "But that's all there is. There's nothing to tell. You know what snow is." This he said almost angrily, for he felt that they were trying to corner him. He turned sideways so as no longer to face the doctor, and the better to see the inch of blackness between the window sill and the lowered curtains, the cold inch of beckoning and delicious night. At once he felt better, more assured. "Mother, can I go to bed now, please? I've got a headache." "But I thought you said—" "Oh, it's just come. It's all these questions. Can't I, Mother?" "You can go as soon as the doctor has finished." "Don't you think this thing ought to be gone into thoroughly and now?" This was his father's voice. The brown slippers again came a step nearer. The voice was the well-known punishment voice, resonant and cruel. "Oh, what's the use, Norman?" Quite suddenly, everyone was silent. And without precisely facing them, nevertheless he was aware that all three of them were watching him with an extraordinary intensity, staring hard at him as if he had done something monstrous, or was himself some kind of monster. He could hear the soft, irregular flutter of the flames, the cluck-click of the clock, far and faint. 2 sudden spurts of laughter from the kitchen, as quickly cut off as begun, a murmur of water in the pipes, and then the silence seemed to deepen, to spread out, to become world-long and worldwide, to become timeless and shapeless, and to center inevitably and rightly with a slow and sleepy but enormous concentration of all power on the beginning of a new sound. What this new sound was going to be, he knew perfectly well. It might begin with a hiss, but it would end with a roar, and there was no time to lose. He must escape. It mustn't happen here. Without another word, he turned and ran up the stairs. Not a moment too soon. The darkness was coming in long white waves. A prolonged sibilance filled the night. A great seamless seethe of wild influence went abruptly across it. A cold, low humming shook the windows. He shut the door and flung off his clothes in the dark. The bare black floor was like a little raft tossed in waves of snow, almost overwhelmed, washed under whitely, up again smothered in curled billows of feather. The snow was laughing. It spoke from all sides at once. It pressed closer to him as he ran and jumped, exulting, into his bed. "Listen to us," it said. "Listen. We have come to tell you the story we told you about. Do you remember? Lie down, shut your eyes now. You will no longer see much in this white darkness. Who could see, or even want to see? We will take the place of everything. Listen." A beautiful varying dance of snow began at the front of the room, came forward and then retreated, flattened out toward the floor, then rose fountain-like to the ceiling, swayed, recruited itself from a new stream of flakes, which poured laughingly in through the humming window, advanced again, lifted long, white arms. It said peace. It said remoteness. It said cold. It said... But then a gash of horrible light fell brutally across the room from the opening door. The snow drew back, hissing. Something alien had come into the room, something hostile. This thing rushed at him, clutched at him, shook him. And he was not merely horrified, he was filled with such a loathing as he had never known. What was this cruel disturbance, this act of anger and hate? It was as if he had to reach up a hand toward another world for any understanding of it, an effort of which he was only barely capable. But of that other world he still remembered just enough to know the exorcising words. They tore themselves from his other life suddenly. "Mother, mother, go away! I hate you!" And with that effort, everything was solved. Everything became all right. The seamless hiss advanced once more. The long, white, wavering lines rose and fell like enormous whispering sea waves. The whisper becoming louder, the laughter more numerous. "Listen," it said. "We'll tell you the last, the most beautiful and secret story. Shut your eyes. This is a very small story. A story that gets smaller and smaller. It comes inward instead of opening like a flower. It is a flower becoming a seed, a little cold seed. Do you hear?" You're leaning closer to you. The hiss was now becoming a roar. The whole world was a vast, moving screen of snow. But even now it said peace. It said remoteness. It said cold. It said sleep. The end. Thank you for listening.